Is Africa holding more leverage than the world ever imagined? For centuries, this continent was treated as a vault of hidden treasure, opened freely to fuel empires, industries, and global comforts. Gold dug from its soil, coffee picked from its fields, uranium pulled from its mines, all shipped away cheap, leaving nations poor while foreign capitals grew rich. That script is changing. From Accra to Kinshasa, from Harare to Abidjan, leaders are no longer whispering in the back room of global trade. They are standing tall, setting rules, and sending shockwaves through markets that once assumed Africa would never speak up. Today, more than 10 African nations have drawn a line. No more raw deals, no more silent giveaways. This is not merely about economics. It is about sovereignty, dignity, and a continent reclaiming its voice. Stay with us. This is more than a policy shift. It is the heartbeat of a new Africa rising. Subscribe and let your voice stand with those rewriting the rules of tomorrow. But here's the question that no one can ignore. If Africa is finally holding the cards, how will the world play the game? Across Africa, a quiet revolution is turning into a thunderous roar. For decades, nations were locked into a pattern. Ship raw materials out cheap, buy finished goods back at high prices, and remain tethered to fragile foreign currencies. But in the last 15 years, a wave of bold decisions has redrawn the map of global trade. Take Ghana. Once known primarily as a steady supplier of raw gold, Accra has now positioned itself as a strategist. In 2022, President Nana Akufo-Addo's government required mining companies to sell 20% of refined gold directly to the Bank of Ghana. The purpose was clear: strengthen reserves, reduce dependency on the dollar, and shield the economy from global shocks. For decades, unrefined gold left Ghana at bargain prices, enriching refineries abroad. Under the new rules, part of that refining happens inside Ghana, keeping more wealth at home. No longer merely the land of extraction, Ghana is becoming the land of ownership. Uganda followed suit in 2021. Known as one of the world's top coffee producers, it stunned the market by banning the export of raw beans. Instead of shipping sacks of unprocessed coffee to European and American corporations, Uganda began to push roasted, packaged, ready-for-shelf products. Farmers who once lived at the mercy of fluctuating prices now stand a chance to share in higher profits. The move is not only about economics. It is about dignity, about ensuring that Ugandan labor is not endlessly undervalued. Global coffee giants were forced to adjust, either paying more for processed Ugandan coffee or scrambling to secure alternatives. Look further west to Gabon. In 2010, Libreville shocked the timber industry by banning the export of raw logs. For decades, forests were felled, shipped to Europe or Asia, and turned into luxury furniture while Gabonese workers were left behind. The government asked a radical question. If our wood can build mansions abroad, why should it not build our own industries? The results were undeniable. Furniture factories, carpentry workshops, and plywood manufacturers sprang up. Jobs multiplied. Value stayed in the country. European companies grumbled at higher costs, but Gabon had rewritten the deal. Mozambique echoed this move in 2017. After years of watching its forests stripped for foreign profits, Maputo banned raw log exports. Today, Mozambican timber is cut, processed, and crafted into products within its borders. Instead of supplying raw planks for others, the nation sells finished furniture and flooring stamped with local identity. The difference is not cosmetic, it is transformative. These examples share a common thread. Africa is no longer satisfied with being the silent supplier of the world. From gold to coffee, from timber to tea, countries are demanding that the first layers of value, refining, roasting, cutting, and shaping, happen on African soil. It is not charity. It is not aid. It is a demand for fairness, for respect, for the right to determine the worth of their own wealth. The world markets have noticed. Investors accustomed to cheap access now face higher prices and tighter supplies. Some call it protectionism. Others call it sovereignty. But one fact remains. Africa is no longer asking permission. It is setting terms. And yet these early moves, as bold as they are, raise a burning question. What happens when this wave of resource control collides with global giants who are not ready to loosen their grip? If Task 1 showed Africa stepping onto the stage, Task 2 is where the spotlight blazes. The shift from supplier to strategist has reached a climax that the world cannot ignore. Consider Niger. For decades, its uranium mines fed France's nuclear grid, providing nearly 70% of the electricity that lights up Paris, Lyon, and Marseille. Yet Niger itself languished near the bottom of global poverty charts, with crumbling infrastructure and limited public services. Uranium left the ground cheaply, profits piled up in Europe, and Niger remained dependent on aid. Then came a turning point. A new wave of leadership announced tighter restrictions on uranium exports. The message was blunt. No more giveaways, no more silent extraction. The reaction was immediate. French energy markets trembled, futures spiked, and analysts warned of instability in one of Europe's most prized energy systems. For the first time, the reality was laid bare. France's much-celebrated energy independence had always been tied to the veins of African soil. One policy shift in Niamey sent ripples across the continent. Niger, long overlooked, had shown it could flick a switch and dim the lights in Paris. Guinea brought a different kind of drama. While global powers wrestled with trade, Guinea turned its gaze inward. Soaring food prices and empty kitchens forced a bold decision: ban the export of staple crops like rice, maize, and yams. For decades, Guinean farms filled foreign markets even while local families struggled to eat. The contradiction could no longer stand. The government declared food sovereignty, citizens first, markets second. Importers abroad scrambled to replace supplies. Prices climbed. And in Conakry, people saw for the first time that their leaders were willing to place dignity above dollar signs. Further south, Zimbabwe struck at the foundations of industry itself. Known as one of the world's top chrome producers, it had for years sent raw chrome abroad to feed stainless steel and alloy industries. Foreign corporations reaped fortunes while Harare collected crumbs. The government changed course, a ban on raw chrome exports, insisting that smelting and processing take place on Zimbabwean soil. Overnight, global supply chains felt the pinch. Companies in Europe and Asia faced higher costs. Zimbabwe, long dismissed as a mere pit stop for raw materials, had become a player rewriting the rules. And then there was the Democratic Republic of the Congo, a giant in waiting. The DRC holds more than half of the world's cobalt reserves and vast copper deposits, minerals that fuel electric vehicles, smartphones, and the clean energy revolution. For years, those minerals left raw, processed abroad, transformed into billion-dollar products far from Congolese hands. But Kinshasa drew a new line: restrictions on raw exports, a demand for refining within the country. The decision forced tech giants to the table. If you want cobalt, if you want copper, you must invest in the DRC's own industry. The balance of power tilted, and the world's clean future suddenly had Africa's signature written all over it. The emotional peak is clear. For generations, African voices were muffled, their wealth stripped quietly under contracts signed in distant boardrooms. Now the roles have reversed. It is not Africa explaining its dependence to the West. It is the West explaining its dependence on Africa. Markets shook. Corporations recalculated, and citizens from Accra to Niamey felt something stirring: pride, possibility, the sense that history was bending toward justice. But here is the cliffhanger that grips us all. If Niger can dim the lights in Paris, if the DRC can hold the keys to the green economy, if Guinea can feed its people before filling foreign markets, what else might this continent switch off or switch on in the years ahead? When African nations began redrawing the terms of trade, the immediate tremors were felt in boardrooms and stock markets abroad. But the deeper consequences, the kind that touch kitchens, classrooms, and parliaments, are unfolding across the continent itself. In the short term, the ripple effects have been both challenging and invigorating. Prices of certain goods rose sharply. Restricting raw exports tightened global supply, and importers passed costs along. Western corporations, long shielded by cheap African inputs, suddenly faced shrinking margins. At home, however, African governments gained leverage. By requiring local refining and processing, they created incentives for factories to rise on their own soil. Jobs that once floated away overseas began to appear in towns and cities. A Ghanaian refinery humming with new activity, a Ugandan packaging plant hiring rural youth, a Mozambican carpentry workshop exporting furniture instead of logs. All of these signal not just industry but identity. The political impact is even more striking. Leaders who champion these policies are no longer viewed merely as administrators. They are seen as protectors of sovereignty. In a region where memories of colonial exploitation remain vivid, citizens recognize the symbolism. Resources once siphoned out cheaply are now guarded as national treasure. The slogan of anti-colonial Africa is no longer confined to history books. It is echoed in policies, speeches, and everyday conversations. Sovereignty is not a theory. It is becoming a lived reality. In the medium term, the stakes grow higher. By holding on to more value at home, countries gain a cushion against global volatility. Consider Ghana. Selling part of its refined gold directly to the central bank strengthens reserves, reducing exposure to fluctuations in the dollar or euro. In Guinea, keeping staple crops within borders means fewer families are left hungry when international prices spike. In Zimbabwe, smelting chrome inside the country builds industrial expertise that can spill over into other sectors. Each of these steps chips away at the dependence that kept economies fragile. Of course, the road is not without obstacles. Building refineries, factories, and processing plants requires capital, often foreign capital. Some fear that Western corporations, though squeezed, may still find ways to dominate the new industries through investment strings attached. Others worry that corruption or mismanagement could blunt the benefits for ordinary citizens. Yet the conversation itself has shifted. Instead of asking whether Africa can challenge global inequality, the question now is how to ensure the challenge delivers lasting results. Politically, these moves are reshaping legitimacy. Citizens, especially the young, demand leaders who do more than maintain old ties to Europe or America. They want governments that act boldly, who dare to confront unfair trade patterns. Leaders who fail to do so risk being swept aside by the rising tide of expectation. The street-level energy is tangible. Radio call-ins buzzing with debate, markets alive with discussions of sovereignty, students posting online about resource justice. For the first time in decades, national policy feels directly tied to national pride. This is where the civil and the political intersect. Economic sovereignty fuels political confidence, and political confidence fuels further economic reform. Each successful step, whether a factory opening, a trade restriction enforced, or a new law protecting local industries, becomes evidence that Africa can indeed chart its own course. But there is a lingering question, one that resonates across Accra, Kinshasa, Harare, and Conakry alike. Will these bold measures truly uplift the everyday citizen, or will they remain symbolic victories while inequality persists? If you see this as the foundation of true African development, say it loud in the comments. Let the world know Africa will not be silent. And yet, beyond the factories and policies, another reality looms. Africa does not act in isolation. Its rise collides with global powers, allies, and rivals alike. Which way will the world turn when faced with a continent no longer willing to be silent? The shockwaves of Africa's resource revolution have not stopped at its borders. Across oceans and continents, policymakers, investors, and diplomats are recalibrating strategies once taken for granted. In Europe, the tremors are sharpest. France, heavily dependent on Niger's uranium, has been forced to confront a vulnerability long hidden behind the facade of energy independence. The European Union, already battling inflation and supply chain fragility, now faces the prospect of paying more for African resources or negotiating under new, stricter terms. Gone are the days when Brussels could dictate the rules without question. The United States watches with cautious interest. On the one hand, American corporations rely heavily on cobalt from the Democratic Republic of the Congo and lithium from Namibia to power electric vehicles and advanced technologies. On the other, Washington is wary of losing influence to competitors. Officials speak of partnership and mutual growth, but the underlying concern is clear. Will Africa lean toward the West or pivot toward alternative allies? Russia and China see opportunity. Moscow frames Africa's push as part of a wider rejection of Western dominance, aligning it with narratives of sovereignty and resistance. Beijing, already entrenched in infrastructure and mining partnerships across the continent, moves quickly to present itself as a more flexible partner. While Western capitals debate terms, Chinese firms break ground on refineries and processing plants, offering loans with fewer conditions but deeper strategic strings. Meanwhile, regional organizations like the African Union and Economies face their own dilemmas. Some leaders praise the moves as historic steps toward self-reliance, while others worry about trade disruptions and retaliation from powerful trading partners. Yet even in disagreement, one fact is undeniable. Africa is no longer the silent participant. It has become the agenda setter. For the United States, the choice looms larger than it first appears. Will Washington embrace Africa as a partner in shaping the future of clean energy, technology, and trade? Or will it cling to outdated models of extraction and dependency? If it chooses the latter, it risks losing ground not only to China and Russia, but to Africa itself, a continent increasingly confident in charting its own path. The stage is global, the stakes are historic, and the tension is rising. And while the superpowers strategize, Africa faces the question that will define its century: how to wield this new power without repeating the old mistakes of others. The story of Africa's resource sovereignty is still being written. The past decade has revealed what happens when nations dare to hold back raw exports and demand fairer terms. But what lies ahead may prove even more transformative or more challenging. The opportunities are immense. By processing resources within their borders, African countries can create jobs for millions, build industries that stretch beyond mining and agriculture, and lay the foundations of stronger middle classes. A factory that refines gold today may train engineers who innovate tomorrow. A coffee industry that exports roasted beans today may inspire a new generation of entrepreneurs who build global brands tomorrow. Sovereignty over resources is not only about wealth, it is about possibility. Yet risks remain. Building and maintaining processing facilities requires investment, technology, and skilled labor. If these are sourced carelessly, new dependencies could replace the old. Powerful corporations, squeezed by higher costs, may attempt to divide nations against one another, offering lucrative deals to some while isolating others. Political instability, too, can derail progress, as rival factions compete to control resource revenues. The dream of sovereignty can only survive if matched with governance, unity, and vision. This is where the power of continental solidarity comes in. If one nation acts alone, it risks retaliation or isolation. But if 10, 15, or 20 nations stand together negotiating as one, the balance shifts irreversibly. The African Union has the chance to turn scattered national policies into a continental strategy, one that protects resources, secures fair partnerships, and strengthens bargaining power on the global stage. The question, however, is whether African leaders will choose unity over competition. Will they resist the temptations of quick profits and short-term deals and instead hold firm to the long game of transformation? The answer will determine whether the current wave is remembered as a fleeting moment or the dawn of a new era. For the elders who recall generations of extraction, and for the youth who dream of building industries of their own, the path forward is clear. Africa must not return to silence. Sovereignty is not a destination, but a journey, requiring courage, patience, and relentless resolve. The story does not end here. The next chapter is being written now by Africa for Africa. Step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. What began as scattered policies in Ghana, Uganda, or Gabon has become a continental wave. From uranium in Niger to lithium in Namibia, from cocoa and Ivory Coast to cobalt in the DRC, Africa is no longer handing its future away in crates of raw materials. It is shaping that future with its own hands. For centuries, the world's prosperity rested on Africa's silence. Raw gold shipped out, raw timber felled, raw beans exported, always cheap, always undervalued. The prophets built empires abroad while villages at home stood still. That era is ending. A new rhythm is rising. A rhythm of sovereignty, of dignity, of nations that refuse to be silent suppliers. This is the heartbeat of anti-colonial Africa in the 21st century. No longer only a memory of liberation struggles, it is alive in trade policies, in resource strategies, in the determination to turn wealth into opportunity. And as industries rise, as factories hum, as farmers see fairer returns, a new chapter of African development is opening. The world is watching, some with fear, others with respect. But the truth is simple. Africa is not waiting for permission. It is writing the rules of its own tomorrow. This is the second wave of anti-colonial Africa, not fought with rifles in the hills, but with policies in parliaments, contracts at negotiation tables, and courage in the hearts of its people. Now the question reaches you, the listener. Do you see this as a passing moment or the foundation of a new era? Will the future remember this as the time Africa finally claimed its place, not as a resource pit stop, but as a power shaping the global order? If this story stirs something inside you, don't just scroll. Share it, speak it, and subscribe, because Africa's tomorrow will not be written in silence. Drop your words in the comments. Africa rise, it's time for Africa, or your own call for dignity and strength. Because history was written without us for too long. The next chapters we write together.